All right, what is up, everybody? Welcome back to another day of SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Friday, August 27th of 2021. Thank you for tuning into the stream here today. Whether you are watching me live or watching this back as a recording later, I appreciate you being here. And if this is your first time watching our stream, I know with football coming around, we're getting new viewers here every single day, which is awesome. This is a live Q&A style show where I answer questions from SaberSim users about SaberSim, about DFS, whatever you guys want to talk about. I do this show live for a reason, and I say this every single day because I want to make sure that you guys get the answers that you need for your questions, right? If you have follow-up questions or clarifying questions, or if I'm going on and on here and not really getting at what you were trying to ask, let me know in YouTube chat or in the Office Hours channel and Slack. We do the show live for a reason. I want to make sure people are leaving here feeling like they are getting their questions answered. So I've got just a couple questions in my queue here today. So if you've got something you've been waiting to ask, get it in early here, pop it into YouTube chat or pop it in the Office Hours channel on Slack. But before I jump in and start answering questions here, I do want to do just another reminder that we are currently doing a beta for our new app redesign. It's a full visual facelift of the app. It also comes with a bunch of new features that people have been requesting and we've been talking about here on stream for a long time. If you are a current SaberSim subscriber, you can use it and test it out. So you can go to beta.sabersim.com and log in with your existing credentials and see all of the new features. There are also there's a video on our YouTube channel where me and Andy about a week ago now walked through some of those new features live on stream. If you end up testing out the beta, shoot me a message in Slack, let me know, and I will add you to a private channel we have in Slack set up where you can send feedback and let us know of any issues you're seeing, if you're seeing anything at all. But we are getting very close there. The beta's looking really good, and our goal is to get that out to everybody here before the start of football season, so stay tuned there. But I'm going to go ahead and just get things started here. Let's go ahead and get our app pulled up. You'll see I am still using the current live version of the app until we totally get everything live there. But let's go ahead and just jump into our first question. So this was a question from Chase here, and it was in support. And he said, is late swap a necessity in order to win? And this is a really good question. And I'm honestly going to say that the short answer to this question is yes. I think it depends a little bit on sports. Is late swap a necessity to win if you're playing baseball and all the lineups are out before lock? Maybe not. Is late swap a necessity in order to win in NFL when there's not really a lot of injury news and everybody that is expected to play is going to play? Maybe not. But if all your lineup cards are not out before lock for baseball, how are you going to react if players in your lineups are later not playing? Or in football, if you're going to roster some questionable players that are playing in the afternoon games and they end up out, how are you going to end up adjusting your lineups? If you're playing basketball at all, if you've played basketball ever, you know how much there are late scratches and starting lineups that come out minutes before each game starts, right? You pretty much have to late swap in basketball. So yeah, I'm going to say probably late swap is a necessity in order to win, or at least late swapping in some capacity. Now, the sites themselves offer some very basic tools to swap your lineups, to do global player swaps and things like that. But if you've ever used those tools, they don't work very well. You run into salary issues and positional mismatches and things like that. You don't have any context for what lineups are getting swapped, so you might end up swapping a hitter in that's facing the pitcher you're playing, or maybe you end up suddenly having a offensive player in football against the defense. You may disrupt some of your stacks you had set up, right? The global swap doesn't work very well. Also, the other thing is that a lot of times, maybe less so in baseball, but definitely in basketball and probably still in football, if somebody ends up getting ruled out, whoever's going to take that guy's spot is probably underpriced, right? If at the last second, starting point guard is out in a basketball game, right? And the backup's coming in and he's 3,500 on DraftKings. That guy is going to be crazy mispriced. He's going to give you a ton of value, and he's probably going to be pretty highly owned. That's an important guy to get into your lineups. You probably want at least some exposure to him. Similar in NFL, right? If a starting running back is out and the backup's going to end up coming in, even if that backup's not very good at his price, he's probably going to be an insane value. You're probably going to want at least some exposure to him. And your options using an old school tool like the ones on the site would be either to just direct quick swap from the starter to the backup and give up thousands of salary, or just swap to some guy that's close to him in salary and ignore that the backup is even now on the slate. So for that reason, I would say in the vast majority of cases, over the long term in a season or something like that, late swap is probably a necessity, or late swapping is a necessity in order to be successful at DFS. At least in the sports that have it, right? Golf, can't late swap. MMA, you can't late swap. I don't think you can late swap in esports either at the moment. So obviously those ones matter a little less. But if you can, I guess this is a good way to look at it. If you can do something in DFS, it is probably likely that the most skilled players are using it to their advantage. Well, maybe you don't need to react to late swap. Even if, let's put it this way, right? Even if you're playing NBA and somebody gets ruled out before lock and you have none of them in your lineups, it's probably still best to late swap to rebuild the lineups to account for the changing news and the changing context of the slate, even if you don't have that player, because that's what the sharpest players, that's what the best players are going to be doing. So if you want to stay competitive with those guys, you want to stay competitive in the contest overall, you've got to be doing that too. So the greatest part about this here, coming around full circle here, is that SaberSim's late swap tool. Let me go ahead and just get some entries in here so I can show you guys this. I know probably plenty of you watching along here have seen or used the entry editor regularly, but for those of you that don't, I want to talk about this real quick. So SaberSim has a late swap tool. It's an add-on with a free 7-day trial if you haven't seen this before. The add-on itself is $19 a month, but I think it pays for itself probably within the very first slate that you have to late swap anything any given month, right? But the coolest thing about it is we have this late swap option here. And when we late swap your lineups, we'll actually use the same principles that we use to build the initial lineups in your late swap, right? So even if another like a traditional optimizer or something like that has a late swap tool, what I guarantee you it's going to do is just lock in the players that are already started, exclude the players that haven't, and then just optimize for the best mean projection around that, right? And even if you've gone in and set a bunch of stacking rules and grouping rules and things like that, those really start to become a problem and get in the way. And a lot of times you have to start tearing down those rules just to get your late swap build to run. Especially if you've only got like 5 minutes, it can be a huge pain. I've been there with that. The coolest thing about the way SaberSim's late swapper works is it does the same thing. It locks in the players that are already locked into the lineup and excludes players that have had their game already started. But it will take our most updated projections and then rebuild the best lineup using principles of correlation and ownership fade and upside in the remaining portions of those lineups. And this all takes place in just typically like under a couple minutes. It's an insanely powerful tool. It is probably, I mean, I don't think there's anything else out there that's doing something similar to this. And I highly, highly recommend it for anybody that is already using SaberSim to at least just give this a try, especially even come football season or particularly in basketball season, because it is a game changer. You really like even baseball going on, right? Like last night, there were 3 or 4 lineups that weren't out at lock. You don't have to sweat that at all, because when the lineups come out and inevitably come out later, you can just rebuild all your lineups quickly without having to worry about it. So anyway, wrapping this question up here. Yes, I would say if your goal is to win and to be profitable over the long term of a season, yeah, late swap is a necessity. You, first of all, can't have players that are out in your lineups. But second, you need to be able to react to that news changing and the way the slate changes or the context of the slate changes. If you want to beat the best players in your contest, which is what it takes to win. So definitely recommend doing that first of all, but also trying out the late swap with the entry editor with late swap add-on and taking part in that free 7-day trial if you haven't already. So, but good question there. I did have one other question that came in right before the start of the show here. This came in via DM. Let me come grab this here. Okay. So, all right, this is a good question. So this question came in from Phil, and he said, I work but love DFS, so play every day, but not every day I have time to do research. There are days where I have 10 minutes to spare and have to run the best lineup. My question, I've been playing in these $25, 155-man, $3,300 tickets to first on FanDuel for NFL opening week. If you had 5 minutes to do nothing but run 4 lineups on SaberSim for this particular satellite, what would your settings be? Would you use the satellite settings or tweak something like smart diversity? It's a good question. And I think if you watch my office hours regularly, you're probably going to know what my answer is here. Let's switch over to FanDuel just for the sake of it here. But my answer is going to be to roll with the defaults, right? There's so much already happening behind the scenes here that sometimes might feel like you're not doing anything, but it's because SaberSim is doing so much for you, right? Correlation, this correlation slider is replacing the need for all of the stacking rules that you'd have to set using any other optimizer. Ownership fade is replacing the ownership sum caps and all the other individual player ownerships and things like that you would have to set with a traditional optimizer. Smart diversity is going to take advantage of our real ranges of outcomes that are driven by our play-by-play simulator and make sure that we're looking at upside and capturing players' true variance, right? That is all just stuff, research process setup that you would have to do on a traditional tool that you're not doing here, but you're still getting the benefits of that, right? So second, in terms of the actual settings that you use to build the contest. So let's see, there's 150 man, right? And it's a satellite and it looks like it's at least multi-entry. I don't know exactly what the max entry is, but if it's 150 man, I bet they got to be between 3 and 20 max, right? So I would use something like this as your settings. And we're putting these settings at the perfect spot by looking at past contests exactly like these, running thousands of lineups at every single individual combination of slider settings, and then just taking the highest expected value, the sliders that literally win the tickets the most often, and we're setting those as the defaults. So we're weighting, not only are these factors already applied, but we're weighting them with the correct amounts. So I would truly, if you were talking about you've got 5 minutes to run 4 lineups, I would run your default settings. I would go over here. I would click 4. I would build your pool. And if that's only a couple minutes and you've still got a little bit of time, if you want to, maybe take a stand or something like that in this exposure thing, right? If you've literally had no time to do research all day, I would say just trust these 4 lineups and remember all the things that are actually happening behind the scenes here, right? You're not just taking a traditional tool and just pressing build and entering those lineups. You're actually taking advantage of correlation and ownership and smart diversity in the exact amount that makes sense. Your lineups have the right kind of stacks you need anyway, and you're good to go, right? I truly believe that these lineups will be competitive in that contest just because of all the things that are going on behind the scenes here, even if you feel like you didn't have a ton of time to do research. Now, on the slates where you have time to do research, right, we talk all the time about all the different ways you can do that. You can run your research builds. You can look at Vegas trends and update projections. You can tweak your ownership. You can tweak your exposures based on projected ownership and where you're trying to get leverage on the slate. But these are competitive lineups right out of the box that have win equity in the contest you're trying to play them in, and I would just leave it alone. Literally, I wouldn't even spend any time worrying about it. But a really good question. I know that's a reality for a lot of people, and I've been there before. Working the 9 to 5 or something like that, and you're sneaking away and you've got 15 minutes to get lineups in before lock. I guess where I live, Mountain Time, 5 o'clock was always lock, but maybe that's different. The exact timing is a little bit different for people depending on your time zone. But I've been there, right? You got 15 minutes. I didn't have any time to do research all day, even if you got a ton of entries, right? And you got to get lineups in quickly. It's just important to sometimes take a step back. Remember all the things that SaberSim is doing for you because it's immense, right? It's easy to just get familiar, especially playing slate after slate. And you forget all the things that it's replacing, all the things that it's just doing for you automatically. So you can actually build lineups like this. I didn't have time to research. I don't have time to set rules. I'm good to go. I know these lineups have win equity. So, Phil, don't know if you are watching me live here. I know this question came in right before the start of the stream here, but I will get you a recording to this video, timestamp it for you. So it starts right when I started answering your question. If you have any follow-up questions for me, just let me know. Happy to talk about this a little bit more. So, okay, Ronald asked, do you take players out of the player pool when you build your lineups? I've been doing that for pitchers, but not hitters. Just wondering if I should let SaberSim worry about who's best. Yeah, it's funny. I've actually gotten this question a few different times this week, which is always totally fine. I've mentioned it here before. I'm always happy to answer questions again, because we all learn a little bit more each time I talk about things. I learn a little bit more each time I talk about things. So even figure out a little bit of a better way to explain it. But I do think it's funny. I think this question has come in quite a bit this week. But the short answer here is no. I typically don't remove players from my pool prior to the build. The only exception there being weather. If there are games that look like they have pretty serious weather concerns, we've talked about it. There's a strategy session with me and Danny up on our YouTube channel talking about weather in MLB DFS. And a big theme of that video is just that if there's bad weather games, especially on a huge slate, probably just exit, play conservatively. The chance of that game being a must-have is lower than you think, given the chance of that game being postponed. That's probably the only situation where I'm really removing players before I start my build. And the reason why is because even these players that are going to be the ones that you are likely to remove, right? Like who are the players that are likely to be players that you might remove, right? There's two things I can think of. One is players that are going to be really lowly projected or maybe have a very bad point per dollar. Maybe you're going to go in and you're going to remove somebody like Shane McClanahan because he costs almost $11,000 on DraftKings. The highest price pitcher on the entire slate, it looks like, even over Garrett Cole. And he's not that guy. We have him projected at 15 points and his value is really low, right? We can pull up his range of outcomes, right? And we see that there are probably some ranges of outcomes here where that guy, where McClanahan pays off his salary, right? Or even as a must-have, right? Some of these high-end ceiling plays, it'd probably be worth it at almost 11K. We know the exact percentage of sims where that outcome happens because we've simulated every single game thousands of times, right? So I don't need to go, I don't want this guy to get in my pool at all. I can use SaberSim as an advisor and say, if you're going to give me this guy at all, look at the simulations that we have for the games and use him, give me an appropriate amount of exposure to Shane McClanahan. I can guarantee you if we ran some test builds here, you probably wouldn't get him in a single entry. You're not going to get him in a 3 max. You probably won't get him in a 20 max. You may get a sprinkling of him just a bit in your 150 max builds, which probably makes sense. That like matches my intuition of how I would want to approach a player like that, right? And I guess the other side of the coin would be a player that is really highly owned, or a player that I expect to be really highly owned. So I think our ownership projections are projecting a pretty flat ownership so far on the slate. But let's take a quick look over at Vegas and just see how the slate's looking. I especially think about this on the hitters side. And let's look. So maybe we'll see how the rest of the day breaks out. It actually looks like it's probably going to be a pretty flat slate. I was looking to see if there was a team that was like a whole run projected over any others, but let's just assume that the Rays hitters are just going to be very chalky tonight, right? And the other side of the coin is like, do I want to remove some Rays players from the pool to just take a stand? And I actually think this would be a case where I would be more inclined to do it. But what I would prefer to do in this particular case, if I think they're going to be the highest owned team, is to bump up the ownership projections. And I've talked before about how sometimes just for a quick way of doing this, I'll just double ownership projections of the team that I think is going to be the chalkiest. And I think that estimates ownership pretty well. So we could like bump this up to this. And I think you can add a little bit of additional value here, especially on the big slates, because I think at times our ownership model is a little conservative. And I think at least in the contest I'm likely to play, the highest projected team at Vegas is likely to be owned a little bit more like this. But then rather than just removing these players from my pool because I'm going to take like an extreme stand on fading the chalkiest team, it's the same deal, right? Our ownership fade slider is going to be better optimized for my particular contest that I'm playing to fade ownership that in a way that makes sense for that particular contest and that for that particular slate. Like we can see it's a 15-game slate today. There's so many plays on the slate that the ownership fade slider is actually pretty low, even for some of the bigger contests. It gets up to moderate for some of these big 150 maxes, but it stays relatively low compared to some other slates. And it may be that with the slider at that particular setting, it actually makes more sense to be like half the field on the Rays and get yourself a little bit of exposure because it's too easy to play Rays bats, get a little bit contrarian at your pitcher and minor stack and build a high upside, high win equity lineup. So I feel like removing players from your pool without there being like weather concerns or something like that is giving you another reason for doing that is just a little bit too brute force of a method for me, that I rather put a little bit of trust in the optimizer to make some of those decisions for me. The low projected players that you might think about removing from your pool when I'm building 150 lineups, I may want a little bit of them, or I may be comfortable with a little bit of exposure in the right lineups for them. And I trust that we can leverage the game simulations we have for those games and give me those players an exposure that makes sense in the amount it makes sense. And same thing with players that are likely to be really chalky, right? You could just remove them from your pool completely and take a really strong stand, but I feel more comfortable trusting the ownership fade slider that's been back tested against more contests than I've ever even played in DFS ever, to kind of determine what the appropriate amount of ownership fade is for the chalkiest teams on the slate. The last thing I'll say on this before I just totally move on is I think there's a case to be made that I think that the case to be made for removing players from your pool, from my perspective, is better done in step 3, where you have an opportunity to see, after running your working build or however many research builds you end up running, where you have a chance to see what the exposures look like. And then from here, maybe make some of those stands, right? Because you're playing with a pool of lineups that we think is already viable for the contest. I like to call this step 3, like my playground of viable lineups for the contest I've chosen, right? We're going to get 500 lineups that work for a 20 max of 25K people. And I can play around here. I know all the lineups are viable. I know all the lineups have win equity for this contest, and I can make some additional stands here. So are there certain slates where I would go in here now and maybe remove the raise completely? Potentially, if I like the upside of other teams on the slate. I'm only playing 20 lineups and I just want to take a stand there. Do we even have any raise? So yeah, we're okay. So like here, right? We're only getting a little bit of raise bats. It looks like we have 1 3 stack, and I think they're going to be the chalkiest team on the slate. Do I just want to remove them and get an extra lineup in with a different team? Sure, maybe. Let's go look at our pitchers. So we didn't end up with any McClanahan. We actually have a pretty good set of pitchers here. But maybe I don't want to play J.A. Happ, especially if he's going to be highly owned. Guy gets lit up pretty regularly. I didn't remove him before my build, but I just don't want to play 2 J.A. Happ lineups. Now I'm removing guys, right? I think this to me just feels a little bit more comfortable. It's a little easier. I don't feel like it's as like brute force removing players from the pool as it is before the build, which is why I like to do it this way in general. So, but really good question. And Ronald, I saw you said, sorry, I must have missed it. No, don't even sweat it. It was more just a remark. Like I think it's been a popular question recently, but again, I'm always happy to return to questions and answer questions again, because DFS is constantly changing, right? Even if it doesn't feel like it, right? Strategies are always going. You're playing against people, and people change, and they read things online and they change their strategies. So I always think it's good to return to some questions. I learn more talking through these questions multiple times. If you guys have watched me answer the same question on different days, I hope you guys are getting something a little bit out of it the second time. And I feel like I also maybe learn a little bit better ways to explain some of this stuff too. So it's totally all good. Always happy to answer whatever questions you guys have, even if they've come up on a show. I've been doing this now here for probably 3 months now, almost, or yeah, about 3 months here, every single day for at least 30 minutes to an hour. So there's bound to be some questions that repeat. Always happy to return to certain things when the time comes. So, but let's see. What other questions do I have going on here? Okay. So good question from Ryan in Slack. And I see this was already, somebody marked this with the bullseye emoji. But he said, have a question about slider settings for sports SaberSim doesn't offer projections for. I'm going to be playing a lot of college football DFS this year. Do you think just copying the slider settings for NFL is a good strategy since the sports are similar? And yeah, it looks like it was B Crimson that dart through or bullseye emoji this one. I think you nailed it, right? The same sport. I think you can probably just use the exact same slider settings. We even talked the other day about how I like to use my slider settings. Since we don't have default sliders for MMA at the moment, I use golf sliders, right? I find those two sports to be pretty similar, both in your not the literal sports, right? But the DFS sports, both they're six players, not necessarily correlated with one another, apart from the obvious negative correlation of 2 fighters playing each other. They're high variance sports, and they're sports where players have similar ranges of outcomes because they have a big binary event for both sports, right? You either win the fight or lose the fight, and you have 2 ranges of outcomes associated with those events. Same thing with golf on a traditional tournament. When there's a cut, you have all your make cut outcomes and all your miscut outcomes, right? Those two sports actually feel very similar to me from a DFS standpoint, and I actually use similar slider settings for those. So yeah, I think it's a good idea. College football and NFL clearly have way more in common with each other on the actual field than golf and MMA. So I think even better case for that example. But I would, as you're building college football lineups, I would just use your NFL sliders as a working point. Knowing that it's a different sport, and if you're a big college football fan and you have kind of a read on it and want to make some tweaks, I would feel maybe a little bit more comfortable than you might typically about tweaking things up or down. But that's exactly where I would start. So good question from B Crimson here. And he said, what are some good bankroll building contests for NFL? That is a great question. And let's go ahead and pull up the lobby and take a look at this. So I will start by saying our contest selection strategies are always pretty similar for most sports, right? They're going to be, if you can play them, play $3 and under, where actually I will say particularly under $3 for NFL. That's where players with $1 million or more in lifetime winnings, they can't even go down there, right? Your field's going to be softer. You get softer fields in NFL already, you get even softer there. We always recommend people to play contests where you have 1,000 or more effective entrants. Now, in NFL, that's almost every single contest because the contests are so big. So maybe less so there. The last thing I would look at is your payout structures, right? There's a lot of really top-heavy contests, even at the low stakes in NFL. And to be careful with really top-heavy payout structures. And actually, that wasn't the last thing. This is the last thing. The contests are so big in NFL that even if you're playing very profitably, you're building very high EV lineups, it can take a long time to realize your edge because there's just a ton of people in the contest, right? So I think it's more important in NFL than any other sport to get as many lineups down as you can to give yourself the greatest % chance of realizing your edge as quickly as possible. So here's literally how I would approach your lineup building process for NFL. I would go in. First of all, make sure you're playing with a bankroll. You're using sound bankroll management principles. You have a certain amount that you've decided you're already going to play for the slate. But go in, pick the slate. You're playing classic, right? Set this to $3 and under. Tournaments only. I would avoid cash games unless you have I think even in NFL where cash is softer, I would say unless you've got a significant bankroll that you're playing with and can afford to, and it's worth it for you to grind out like a 3 to 5% ROI over a long period of time, avoid the cash games, right? Stick to tournaments. And then I would, there's a few different ways to do this. I think probably the easiest way is to just reverse the entry fee because our goal here, again, is to get your lowest dollar contests possible. So you're maximizing the amount of lineups you can play, right? So you can see I've already entered a few contests for NFL week 1, but they're actually going to be pretty similar to what I would actually play, but always grab these free rolls, right? Might as well get the free shots when you can, but get into some of these dime packages, especially the big ones, right? Over 1,000 effective entrants. These dime packages, I actually think can be somewhat useful to join as well if you want some additional action on these, but these are maybe ones that I wouldn't just jump right into. They have 1,000 or more effective entrants, but if you're playing these, you probably want to use them more as just a tool to get additional action on certain lineups, because the worst thing in the world would be to just by bad luck have a lineup with crazy high upside in this and take home $25 when it could have been in this, and you take home $2,500, right? So I would play these if you want to get some additional action on your top lineups, but I would definitely play things like the quarter jukebox, right? A contest that is enormous. It's massive. It's a hard contest to win, but the field is going to be crazy soft in this. You have what? That would be, I can't even do this off the top of my head, 2,000 effective entrants potentially. Is that right? No, 20,000 effective entrants, right? There's not that many sharp NFL DFS players. So great contest to play. I would keep it rolling here and definitely recommend playing some of these easy single entries below $3 on the daily dollar, both of these, right? I would play things like the single back. If you still need to get additional bankroll down, I would play the first down, the $1 20 max, right? These contests all grade out by the same principles. 1,000 or more effective entrants were under $3. And One thing I haven't talked about is payout structures yet. Most of the payout structures at the low stakes are actually going to be pretty good. But the main thing you want to look for is there's a few things. So first of all, I have this little browser extension, which makes this a little bit easier. It's actually a RotoGrinders browser extension, but it's available for both Firefox and Chrome. It's not the best. It slows down your browser a little bit, actually, I've noticed. So sometimes I turn it off, but it's on right now. The ideal contest, the perfect contest, in my opinion, is a min cash of 2x, which this one doesn't have, right? But sometimes you're going to min cash. It's nice to recoup some of that money. And then I would say the red flag gets raised if first, if you're truly trying to find the best contest to build a bankroll, if first is bigger than about 10% and the top 10 is bigger than about 20%, those start to be really top heavy contests that with the number of people in these NFL contests can be, there's a lot of money up top. It's hard to build a bankroll, right? So this is a pretty decent contest. It's not a 2x min cash, but it has a very flat payout structure. Even if you place a lineup, if your lineup comes in, I don't know, 50th or something like that, right? That's $250. That's a 250x return. That is pretty good compared to what you would get paid out on something like the Millie Maker for a similar placed finish, right? And you can continue to go here. Well, I don't know why they put 50-50s in when you say tournaments. That's not great. I think even if you're still trying to get additional bankroll down, you're staying under that $20 range. I think the safety is one where you start to break that rule of the 1,000 effective entrance. I think this is just a little bit, this is going to be a little bit under 1,000 effective entrance, but it still has a pretty good payout structure. It's under $3. The min cash isn't great. This can be another good contest to get into. If you're still looking for additional bankroll to get down, this is kind of where you start to have to make some decisions. One other contest I will mention, I should have mentioned it earlier, is this $3 single entry. All the single entries are typically good ones to play. But if you start playing all of those, you're going to start running into, you're going to have to make some decisions, right? You're either going to have to get above the $3 line and welcome all the sharks into your contest. You may have to play some other lower stakes contests that don't have 1,000 effective entrants in them. You may have to venture into some contests that don't have some payout structures, right? But you can get down to quite a bit of action, quite a bit of volume at the low stakes here on DraftKings for NFL, and without breaking any of our rules. So that's kind of like where I would start for NFL. And I would enter all those contests with unique lineups because they all have so many entries in them, right? You're basically, your like realistic goal here is to build really strong lineups, really use sound bankroll management principles, stick strongly to this contest selection. And the payouts are so good in NFL, you're basically trying to win like once, right? Like even if you took down the dime time, $750 is pretty good. But I mean, if you take down the quarter jukebox or something once, like this is going to pay for most of your season. This is kind of ends up how NFL ends up looking because they're hard to win. So there was a question from Ronald here about FanDuel. So we can go over to FanDuel as well. I don't play as much FanDuel, may get into it a little bit for NFL, but we'll pull this up here. You can see balance is a little bit lower here. Haven't really been playing too much on FanDuel, but it's the same principles. FanDuel works the same overall way. They restrict entries from $3 and under. So I would do the exact same thing. I would come over here. I'd set this at 3. And FanDuel doesn't have actually a lot of contests up yet. I forgot about this. So you can see I've already dabbled in here. I've already poked my head in. I think this was from a free ticket, this one in the Millie Maker. But it would be a similar structure for FanDuel. They don't have all their contests up yet. So a little bit harder for me to do a full look through the lobby. But Pooch Punt, like, can you beat out 1 million entries? It's going to be hard, but it's going to be a really soft field. It's probably positive EV to play this contest for $7.50. I would enter that. This is another contest that, 50, like these contests are just huge. So they're hard to win. 500K, it's hard to beat, but it's probably a very soft field. It's probably positive EV to play that contest. But the big ones, the really nice ones, are those single entries, those 3 maxes under $3. Those are the single best contests you can probably play for NFL, really for all sports, but particularly in NFL. So that's where I'd start. I'm happy to return to this question too once FanDuel gets like all of their opening main slate week 1 contests in, because it seems like they've just put like an initial amount of contests, probably the ones that they're most concerned about filling for week 1 up. So we'll come back to this, but a question from Ship here. My projections come from where? How did you get these projections? And is it best to change the projections before or after you build? That is a fantastic question. So what is unique about SaberSim's projections is they are not determined with spreadsheets or anything like that. They are an average of game simulations. So we simulate every game thousands of times, and a player's projection is their average across all the game simulations. So when we say Garrett Cole is projected at 23.66, what we are saying is that of the thousands of game simulations where he has this crazy wide range of outcomes from scores in the negatives to scores at almost 60 DraftKings points, the average score is 23.66. And when we build your lineups, we don't use the average score and optimize for that. Based on where your smart diversity slider is set, we take random buckets or random groups of those game simulations, which basically allows us to randomly sample a player's real range of outcomes randomly, and then use those as projections to build your lineups, right? Which is why your exposures essentially ultimately can kind of sometimes match like the times that player is a good play, right? So that is where your projections come from. And that is why SaberSim, part of the reason why SaberSim is so powerful is that our projections are not just a number, right? They are an average of a full player's range of outcomes, and we tap into those full ranges of outcomes when we build your lineups. So second question here, is it best to change the projections before or after you build? I would say if you're going to be editing projections around and tweaking things, I would do it before you build. Let me answer this question in 2 parts. I would say first, I would do a test build with default sliders and default projections to get an idea of what SaberSim wants, what kind of lineup SaberSim wants to build that day anyway. Then go back, make adjustments to projections on the team side or on the player side as you see fit, and then go back and build a new build that appropriately takes in those updated projections as inputs, right? You can edit projections on step 3, but all we're going to do is basically resort the original lineups, the original pool of lineups that you built based on the new information that you're giving us about a player's projection here in step 3. So if you're going to do like rigorous changing around of the projections, they're not even rigorous, right? If you're really going to touch the projections at all, I think you are better fit to do that here on step 1 so that we build you a full pool of 500 or 1500 or 75 or whatever the lineup pool is that matches your assumptions about the slate and actually takes everything into account beforehand. So that is what I would recommend. Make your adjustments, run your test build so you at least know what SaberSim wants to do by default, right? How it's attacking the slate. But then make your adjustments to projections and run a brand new build. That's probably the best way to do that. So I missed this one. This was from Aaron here. How did you feel about using more 4-man stacks? How did you feel about using more 4-man stacks and larger GPPs? Yeah, I go back and forth on this like all the time. There's a part of me that wants to answer this question by saying, and there's a part of me that actually plays this way, that is saying correlation is where it's at for a reason, right? Again, I mentioned it earlier at the start of the show if you missed it. The amount of lineups and the amount of lineups that are built at every single slider setting when we back test these is more than I could play even like in an entire season. It might be multiple seasons of testing. And there's a part of me that wants to say correlation is where it's at for a reason. And if I run 150 lineups at correlation at 8 and I get mostly 5 stacks, but some 4 stacks and even some 3 stacks, it's all good because the correlation slider is set where it's at, right? That's how I feel on one side. On the other, I know that players in my contests are not stacking enough still in baseball. And I feel like there's roster construction leverage in building bigger stacks. So I feel like it makes sense to do this or to do this even. Like I've been experimenting with this on like a 15-game slate, right? There's 15 baseball games tonight. People are not going to stack 5 stacks often enough for how likely it is that one team has like a complete ceiling performance. And it makes me want to do that. I don't think there's a wrong answer either way. Let me put it that way. I think you're playing kind of 2 sides of the same coin. I think what always concerns me about doing this is that I'm basically locking myself into a certain construction that doesn't have necessarily like 100% win equity. If especially if you're playing bigger contests, right? If it's not a 5 stack tonight, then you just lose. You just don't get there. And this can feel a little bit concerning from that perspective to me, but I do feel like there's still leverage that direction. So I would say short answer, I don't think there's a right I don't think there's a right answer to this. And if you're looking for something concrete, I would say avoid the stacking rule and let the correlation slider guide you. Because again, that slider is back tested with more lineups than any of us could probably even really realistically play in a season. And it's set where it's at for a reason. And a lineup that you're getting maybe that has a 3 stack or is like a 4-2-1-1 or something like that is probably has the right amount of leverage or upside based on the way these other sliders are set, and it's still viable. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question. But let's see. Does the projections give you more exposure to players if you change it? In theory, yeah. A player that you increase the projections for is going to give you more exposure to that player. And if you lower projections, you're going to get less exposure to players. But there's a lot more going on, right? Like if you lower, let's say our favorite stack on the entire slate is Toronto, just for example, right? If you go in here and just take one random guy and lower Guerrero by like to 9 or something like that, you might not get that much less exposure to Vladimir Guerrero because he's correlated to all the other players in the lineup. You may get like a couple less lineups with him, but he's correlated to all the other Toronto bats. If the builder still wants to play Toronto, it's going to find a way to do that. Same thing with a player that is maybe necessarily very, let's say, low owned, or let's say like they're very highly owned or something like that. So, there's not really a lot of guys like that on this slate because it's 15 games, but let's say Garrett Cole was 50% projected owned or something like that. And that means that the builder is going to be somewhat cautious about using him because he's by far the highest projected owned pitcher on the slate. And we have an ownership fade slider that is on and it's moderate, and it may reduce the exposure to Cole if he's going to be that highly owned. Even if you go in and slightly tweak the projection up a little bit, it may not be that he ends up much higher in your exposures if the builder still thinks he's too highly owned for his projection. So, like very generally speaking, yes, increasing projection, you're going to get more exposure. Reducing projection, you're going to get less exposure. But there's other things at play here, like correlation and ownership fade. There's also obviously players that are just like not going to show up in your lineups at all. Like, I don't know. We look at some of the worst. I don't know. Like, let's find a play that's like really spectacularly poorly projected. Actually, I don't even think I need to do the example, but you guys get the idea, right? Like, if the builder just doesn't want to play Candelario at all, he's got a really low projection, playing Toronto, who presumably has a good pitcher going tonight. Like, if you just bump him up slightly and you were getting 0 exposure before, you may not get any exposure after. But anyway, I think I've spent enough time on that question. Pretty straightforward there. Aaron said, I'm hearing a lot of talk about this in NFL, bigger game stacks for small field GPPs. Yeah, that makes sense. That's the right way to approach it, right? And our slider should actually reflect that. So if we go, let's look at week 1. I'm curious how this looks, actually. Let's go ahead and reset this too. And reset projections. Okay. So, yeah. Let's see. Okay, so it depends a little bit, but like let's look at just single entry. Interesting. Okay, I mean, that makes sense intuitively to me. This idea that you need to be right about less the smaller the field of the tournament you're playing, right? If you're playing a huge contest, massive, I don't even know, Millie Maker, right? You almost need the optimal, like the stone cold optimal of the highest scoring player, the highest overall actual scoring lineup you could make. You may not, but you need something close. And if there's 3 random receivers that go out and score 3 touchdowns, even if you end up having the highest scoring quarterback on the slate, right? And all of his receivers go off. If you don't have the 3 guys that like are the stone cold nuts, you're not going to win the Millie Maker. But in a small field GPP, you probably can win or be very competitive just having the team right, having the right stack. And if you have the right stack, maybe you just have like one other player on the run back, right? And you have a game stack because you know that game is a positive scoring environment, and the run back isn't the optimal running back too on the slate or something like that, but he's playing in a game that has a positive scoring environment. He has an 85th percentile outcome, and that's another thing that adds on, right? And you like correlate your running back to your defense because the running back's going to run the ball a lot when the defense is doing well or something like that. And you don't end up with the best running back 1 and the best overall defense, but those guys are correlated. They both have 85th percentile outcomes, and you're putting together a lineup that's like really super correlated here, and it works and it wins a small field GPP. But again, in the large field stuff, you need like the best at every position, more or less, especially for NFL. So I think that makes sense, right? Your stacks and your correlation in general should be a little bit higher in the smaller field stuff. So, let's see. Ship said, in stacking rules, can you get one-offs from a team that you don't want to include in a team stack? Yes, you can. So if we were setting baseball stacks here, we'll hop back to baseball real quick. And look at the stacking rules. And let's say we had decided that we were going to play a 5 stack and we were only going to include some random teams here. And these are the teams we want a 5 stack. Yes, any of these teams that are grayed out can still show up as one-offs. They can also still show up as minor stacks. You could end up with a San Diego 5 stack that also has a minor Angels 3 stack alongside it. If you want to avoid that at all, and you don't want these teams to show up as stacks, I would set an additional stacking rule that says probably at least 2 players and be willing to build either 5 2s or 5 3s and just remove these guys like this as well. And if you don't want to do that, but you don't want any one-offs of the teams you don't want to stack, you should just remove them from your pool. So go through and just... Well, I would actually do it like this. I would highlight the team, click all batters, and just uncheck the players. If you don't want them to show up as stacks, and you already set a stack rule that doesn't include them, and you also don't want them to show up as one-offs, then you just don't want them. So just remove them from your pool is what I would recommend doing there. So, cool. Let's see. Question from Phantom here trickled in Slack on me, and I missed this. And he said, for sports that don't offer sim variance at least yet, like MMA, NASCAR, is it best to run default sliders? Apologies if this was similar to Ryan's question. So if you're reading this and you're like, sim variance, what is going on? There was a ping in the beta channel the other day. Hasn't made it out to live. It probably just won't until we just go live with the redesign. But we are kind of renaming smart diversity to sim variance. Get a lot of questions, especially from new users to SaberSim, that are like, what is smart diversity? What is it actually doing? And we think sim variance explains a little bit better what it actually is. Like, yes, it gives you diversity, but it does a lot more things than that. And sim variance is, I think, a little bit more descriptive, right? When you turn this up, the actual variance of the sim ranges of outcomes of any players gets wider because we're using a smaller bucket of game simulations, right? If your bucket includes a lot of ceiling outcomes, that player's going to show up in a lot of your lineups, right? There's natural variance there. That's what creates diversity and upside. So, but for this question that don't offer sim variance at least yet, is it best to run default sliders? Well, the defaults are not really defaults, and maybe we could do better messaging about this, but like this, I could be wrong about this, and maybe I need to go back and check, but I don't believe these are default sliders. My understanding is that these are like the literal defaults that you need for the build to run, right? If we turn this off completely, you're just going to get cache lineups. We're not even going to use any randomness at all. That's no good. So this has some randomness, but I think that from there, this is just like kind of nothing, right? These aren't actual defaults. So I would set these to something. And I think you can use your intuition a little bit about the way the sport is played to determine that. I talked actually at the start of the show about how I find that MMA and golf DFS play similarly. They're high variance sports with a big binary outcome of either winning the fight, losing the fight, or making the cut, missing the cut. And I like to borrow PGA sliders for making my MMA lineups. I frankly don't know enough about NASCAR to give you a direction. Oh, NASCAR actually has a default. So maybe these do have some. I'd be curious. I may need to go back and ask the rest of the team like why these are set the way they are, if they're true defaults or not. Because it's actually strange to me that this has a value here. But I would definitely probably feel, especially since this doesn't dynamically update to your contest, I would feel comfortable applying your intuition and understanding about the DFS sport and making adjustments to these as you see fit based on, I don't know, you could use another sport as a guideline. I don't know NASCAR well enough to speak to like whether it's a highly more variant sport or not. And I wouldn't want to tell you what sliders to play for something like this. I feel more confident about MMA. But for any of our sports that don't have the contest dropdowns, you already know at a baseline at the moment, it hasn't been back tested at the contest level, at the individual contest level. So for that reason alone, I would feel more comfortable making updates here based on the contest you're playing, your understanding of the payout structure in that contest, and your understanding of the sport overall. How good is the chalk? How variant is the sport, right? If chalk is kind of bad, bump this up. If the sport is high variance, bump this up and go from there. So my MMA sliders for the contests I typically play, similar to what we recommend for golf, often look something like this. Is the way I approach it right now at the moment, because this is what's recommended for the golf sliders for big 150 max and things like that. So, cool. Ship said, can you show me one more time how to late swap? Had players yesterday that killed me because I was not able to get the players out before lock, or is there a video I could watch? Yeah, so here's what I would do. So you're playing baseball, right? And you have your lineups in, and it's after lock, and somebody gets scratched, and you got to make a move quick. Here's always what we recommend, is use quick swap first. Quick swap is going to make it so you at least don't have any players that aren't playing in your lineups. It's like Andy always says, it's like the global player swap on DraftKings on steroids. So what it does, you click quick swap, and you can just do it literally like this. So all out players is going to look for every player that's literally either marked out or has a projection of 0. And just click apply and download. It's not going to do anything right now because there's no out players. The slate hasn't started. But if the slate has started, what it's going to actually say here, it's going to look for all the players that are marked out or have a 0 projection in your lineup, and just remove them. And it's all going to happen in just a second for you. It's going to spit out a new entries file, and you can just save it and quickly upload it, right? You can do this process in basically seconds. If you're quick, and then you just upload that file to DraftKings, and that will save you from just having the players that are out in your lineups, right? From there, what I recommend is actually doing a new build with the late swapper, because what you're going to do is you're going to rebuild the lineups, and actually take into account the effects of correlation and ownership fade and smart diversity, and rebuild the lineups around the players that are already locked into the lineups. So quick swap is nice because it gets the players that are out, but it runs into some problems. We talked about this earlier actually, but it runs into some problems of like, you might end up swapping in a guy that is playing against your pitcher, or it may not, you may break up a stack and your lineup may not be as correlated as it was before. So after you run your quick swap to just make sure all the players are out, then click late swap, run another build, and build this, right? You can typically just use the same default settings or whatever settings you did to run your initial build. This, I don't have any lineups in right now. I just have reserved entries, which is not a good thing, but that's what I have right now. This will just say your total number of unique lineups, and you can just click build. This, when you run this, is going to take you to like a similar looking build page, and it'll say late swap build or something up here. And then you can just download your entry file over here on the right once the late swap runs. So that is basic rule of thumbs, right? Something that happens and you can't react. Always start with the late swap tool. Or excuse me, I had two options. I said the wrong one. Something happens, you can't react, or you need to react quickly. You just want to get all the guys that are out. use the quick swap first. This is especially true for like NBA, where this news literally does come with like 2 minutes to make changes. Use the quick swap tool first to get all the guys that are out of your lineups. Then second, go back over to late swap and rerun your build so that you can kind of re-optimize for correlation and ownership and upside and things like that. So, yeah. That, I think, is kind of my quick little demo on how I would go through the late swap process. But let me know if that helps, Ship. And if you run into trouble ever, always feel free to pop something into Slack in support or in the baseball channel or whatever sport you're playing. We typically have somebody around that can kind of at least lend you a hand, get you straightened out. Otherwise, I mean, most of our users are also extremely helpful with that kind of stuff if you're running into issues. So, but okay, guys, cool. So I think I am all caught up on questions here today. We are just now approaching an hour, and I am going to have to kind of cut things off right at about the hour mark here for today's show. I know we had some longer streams earlier in the week here, but do have to cut this one right off at 1 o'clock my time. But thank you to everybody that tuned in and watched Office Hours all week. Thank you to everybody that participated and asked questions, whether you asked questions in YouTube chat, emailing us, support@sabersim.com, DMing me, or posting questions in Slack. You guys make this show possible. I appreciate everybody here that's been tuning in and asking questions. And I hope this continues to be helpful for you guys, right? The goal here, this show is meant to serve you guys, get your questions answered and things like that. So if you ever have any feedback for me or things that we could do to make the show a little bit better, always feel free to reach out. You can DM me if you want to talk to me privately, or email us, support@sabersim.com, or email anybody on the support team and give us some feedback. But I will see you guys here again next week, Monday, 2 p.m. Eastern. We'll be right back at it again. Next week is the last week without regular season football, which is pretty exciting. So getting very close to football season. Looking forward to that greatly, and enjoy the 15-gamer tonight. MLB Friday slates are always a blast. Have a great weekend. I'll see you guys on Monday. Take care.